one issue that has been current within our history and political development, and which is very, very controversial, is the Mandingo question. There are a lot of our kinsmen, Liberians, who look at the Mandingo as foreign elements, when in fact there are evidences in history of their presence here within this region that is currently known as Liberia. And I noticed in your presentation you talked about traders coming, I suppose, from the Sahel, Mandingo traders coming from the Sahel, and coming, inching their way along, and bringing along Islam, but in a way that was very tolerant to the diverse groups of people they met. So I would like to ask this question: how did the movement, or how did the paradigm shift from people control to territorial control by the nascent Liberian state? How did it impact? How did it impact the question as well of the Mandingo presence in Liberia? How did it impact that particular issue, taking into consideration their origin and authenticity as residents of pre-settler Liberia?
Okay. Certainly, small groups of Mandingos have been like wandering into Liberia, what is modern-day Liberian territory, for a very long time. I think we can trace certain families back almost 200 years as residents in what is modern-day Liberia. These are not new people who just came. But they came in a manner where there was greater emphasis on their part in trading than there was in farming. So for them, there was not the need for territory as such, and for a residential area as such. And so traditionally you didn't have, quote, Mandingo tribal areas. You had Mandingos scattered among peoples in the Vai area, in the Gola area, in the Bandi area, GC area, Loma area, and among the Mano, the Ma, Namia, and the Dan, or the Kio areas. They were coming for trade, coming for salt, coming for cola nuts, back to the Sahel, or to the savannah, and they were coming for gold, for minerals. Now what happens is that with the imposition so this is a very old population in this country, and it's, I think, one that needs to be emphasized. These Mandingos are as much a part of Liberia as any other group who are here. But with the coming of the central government's imposition of social control over the country, land, territory became important. And Mandingos were, in one sense, in a quandary, because they had not, quote, occupied a territory for the purposes of controlling that particular territory, because they were scattered, because they were basically not farmers. There is a fairly long history to what is the modern-day Kwaduboni up near Banjuma, that chiefdom, that is a Mandingo chiefdom. And there is a contiguous Mandingo chiefdom on the Guinea side. These were contested territories because there were Loma and there were Bele in these areas. But in time, on the Liberian side, that area, because it was heavily populated by Mandingos, came to be recognized by the central government. I think it's not until Barclay's time, Edwin Barclay's time. It may have been in King's time, but I think it's Edwin Barclay's time, as a distinct territory that was Mandingo. fairly recent concept. Then, certainly it was in Berkeley's time, and I know a little more about the history of this, because there were a large number of Mandingos scattered in that corridor between the Bandi Loma area, Bopolo, and down towards the St. Paul settlement area today, Vanswa, for instance, Svend, Vanswa. There was a move on in the 30s by those people, since chiefdoms were important now in this new system, to have their own chiefdom. And so there is the creation by Berkeley of the Mecca chiefdom, or Maka chiefdom, that is essentially carved out of a Gola, what was at the time thought to be a Gola area. And the president's uncle, Zwana Johnson, was one of those people who fought very hard against that. He was the clan chief at that point into the territory neighboring that, and in fact, in the middle of the night, moved the boundary posts that would have been twice. But the central government came back in and said, no, this is where the boundary is going to be. That was an artificial creation for Mandingos. There are still a few Gola towns in that chiefdom, but it was designated by the central government as a Mandingo chiefdom. So, and I have to tell you that I have real concerns now with the new proposals that are before the legislature about boundary harmonization, about chiefdoms like this that are distinct entities that were historically created that might well get wiped out in the new legislation. But that's another issue. The point is that over time, Mandingos then obtained territorial areas. Now, added to this, and I think it is a more recent issue, my sense is that, and it's actually during my lifetime, is that with the change in the political system in Guinea and with the coming of independence with Secretary and so on, many Mandingos fled Guinea and moved into Liberia, saw economic opportunities, now in new ways, new niches, taxi drivers, goldsmiths, a variety of tailors and so on. And so there was a new wave in more recent times of Mandingos into Liberia. And I think there is a confusion that exists when people think about Mandingos today, because they think probably more towards those more recent arrivals of Mandingos. And they lump them together with the older Mandingo residents here and say that they're all strangers. Don't realize that there is this older population that has been here for a very long time. The people in the Mecca chiefdom, you may well know this, don't speak Mandinka. They speak Bele. They speak a Bokomo form of Bele. It's not the same as spoken in Bong County, but it's Bele. That's their first language. It's not Mandinka. They happen to be Muslims, but they're not Mandingo speakers. But they carry the Mandingo surnames. And so I have an instance in a sense in my own family, because there's a family that was linked to my family going back to 1952, where three people, a father, son, and grandson, walking back from Mecca, stopped by Taylor's people, and were asked who they were, and they said that they were Chromos, and they were murdered, carried off to the St. Paul River, stones put around their feet, thrown into the river. They had nothing to do with any of the political issues going on, but because they carried the Mandingo name, they were lumped with all of the other Mandingos as being against Taylor. So there are distinctions that exist in terms of the Mandingo community, but the tendency is to think simply, if you like, and to think that all Mandingos are the same.
So can we say then that the move by the Liberian government at the time, in whatever stage of formation it may have been, that the move to exercise status control over these territories and impose centralized control, in a way, disenfranchised Mandingos to a large extent and succeeded in creating the misperceptions or the perceptions that many Liberians have today of Mandingos?
Well, I don't think they were disenfranchised, because everybody was disenfranchised.
In a sense that...
in fact, they were recognized by the government as distinct by the creation of these chiefdoms for them.
Yes, agreed, but in the sense of, from the perception of local people, linking tribes to ancestral lands. Like for instance, the Loma can point and say this is our ancestral land, Lofa, the Beles, though they are Kwa-speaking group from the southeast, but over the years migrated to this area, can say this is our ancestral land. Now, except for this chiefdom, this Kwadubodi chiefdom that we refer to, I virtually know of no other area in which Mandingos can say, well, this is our ancestral land. And so the point that I'm making is that the state, decision by the Liberian state in imposing central control over what were small city-states and what have you in their formative stages, sort of help to drive this perception that these people are aliens and do not belong to this body politic.
Well, first of all, I think you have to look at who's an ancestor and who's an ancestor. I mean, how far back are you going? The Loma or even the Bele are strangers to the land. It depends on what time point you want to start at and say, now this land is theirs. Because at one point they were strangers also. It's just that the Mandingo may have come more recently than some others. But then, you know, who has more right? And what the central government decided vis-a-vis the Mandingos was that even though they didn't have a territory that, quote, was their ancestral territory, in the sense that you're talking about, that given the nature of the political system that they were creating, and in which it was clear that Mandingos were seen as different, ethnically different from others, that they too should have a territory that was their own. And so that, if you like, was imposed upon the others. But in terms of enfranchisement, if as you speak of that, I mean, they were all equally disenfranchised. If you're thinking in terms of vote, in terms of participation in government and so on. But this allowed, at least in terms of the structure that was being created at the time, for the Mandingos to have chiefs who could be represented and could be recognized by the central government and could be worked with in the same way as others had chiefs, as opposed to an amorphous group of people who were sort of scattered everywhere, but who were seen by local people as different, but in fact didn't have a territory of their own.
Now, in your writings on Liberian history, you've written much about what is referred to as the Congo Confederacy. Now, for our purposes, could you say what was this Congo Confederacy? What objectives its formation sought to achieve, and how did the pursuit of those objectives impact settler and indigenous people relationships?
Okay, good. I'm actually the one who coined the phrase confederation for the group. It had not been used before.
Who were the dominant, which ethnic groups are the dominant elements of that confederacy?
Okay. Bandi, Loma, and Ningo. They're all part of that great trading route that existed from Musudugu or Musudu, depending on which history you have read about today, Musudugu, all the way coming south with Bopolo as a trading center, but coming through the Kwaduboni area southward, and then to the coast, all the way between Bai country and Day country to the sea. This was a trading confederation, and there were various leaders who settled in Bopolo to create a halfway point, if you like, in the trade route for traders coming from their areas to the coast. And they came, in a sense, they lived in towns, and you can still find these distinct towns today in that area, that then populated, each ethnic group populated a distinct town. And they chose to band together as a group of people politically for the purposes of trading and for the purposes of defending themselves against the surrounding Gola. Now, the settlers found that confederation when they arrived here, and you know the history of Salboso helping the settlers to achieve their treaty with the local Day chiefs, in a sense forcing them to accept the treaty that they signed. Salboso at the time was the leader of that confederation. Dies in about 1837, I think it is. He's the one, but he's working with a series of leaders of the other ethnic groups who are in that confederation in the surrounding towns. Their main purpose was trade. It was not agriculture. It was not any other thing than keeping a trade route open. They had problems with the Gola between themselves and the coast, and there was conflict there, particularly as the Gola also were pushing the Day farther and farther towards the coast. The settlers linked because they needed trade goods and because they wanted to trade themselves. They interlinked themselves with the people in Buffalo. The McGill family took in Salboso's son as a ward, and there were others who took in people from children from that area, or were given the children from that area, because that's a pretty common pattern. And so the settlers saw that advantage in terms of trade, and the people of this trading community saw settlers trading with the settlers as advantageous to themselves. So it's a mutual benefit. The problem came into the fact that the people of the Congo Confederation people wanted to trade as slaves, which they had been traditionally, and the settlers didn't want that. So that's where at times conflict occurred between them because of that objection on the part of the settlers. But basically it was to the advantage of the settlers to have open trade routes to Buffalo and on. They were never allowed to go beyond. Traders, Liberian settler traders could go as far as Buffalo, but they were never allowed to go beyond Buffalo because the people in Buffalo didn't want to get bypassed. And so they held very tight to control beyond Buffalo. So there are essentially, I know of no settlers who go to the interior before in the 1850s because of that worry on the part of the Congo people that they would be bypassed. Now, once Salboso dies, his son takes over. Momolosao, I think is his name, and his town is Totoquele, which is a town that still exists. And he built a two-story house for himself in Totoquele from his experience of seeing what the settlers built on the coast. And had furniture, Western furniture in his house and so on.
So can we say that absent the interpolation of the Liberian state or the formation of the Liberian state in 1822, this confederacy could have possibly evolved into a viable nation state?
It's interesting to speculate. I'm not sure that it would have. They were in severe conflict with the surrounding Angola in particular, who were not participants in this trade, were not allowed basically to participate in the trade. There were in the political structure itself was fairly amorphous, fairly weak. And there were problems of succession, particularly after Momolosao died. There are leaders that emerge, but there are periods of conflict in which this confederation weakens. Now, I'm not sure exactly when it finally expires as a group, but it's into the 1870s, maybe early 1880s. I don't see it, given the nature of the political structure, It had no territorial interests as such, because its main focus was trade. But who knows? I mean, it's hard to speculate on history and what would have been if this hadn't been.
Now,
and I might add here, yes, you would have had Europeans on the coast, and maybe in time you would have had another colonial power move in. Liberia would not have been left unoccupied during a scramble for Africa. If it wasn't the Liberian settlers, it would have been the British or the French, or even the Germans at one point would have taken over. So Liberia would have been occupied one way or the other.